Located on the west coast of North America in the province of British Columbia in Canada lies the city of Vancouver. Known worldwide for its stunning mountains, ocean views, and unique urban geography that mixes high density with loads of green space, the Greater Vancouver region is a favorite destination for people from across Canada and the world. Over the decades since colonization first began on the west coast, the history of Greater Vancouver has been intrinsically linked with migration from Asia, the most predominant of which is modern-day China. In this video, we'll explore how Greater Vancouver, and more specifically the smaller city of Richmond, became the most Chinese city in North America. So as always, be sure to subscribe, and let's get into it. So the modern story of Canada's west coast has pretty much always been connected with folks from China, though it wasn't until 1858, when gold was found on the Fraser River, that the first major migration of people came to British Columbia, both from China and many places around the world, particularly the United States. A significant portion of the earliest Chinese settlers to the Pacific colony came from California, as that region's gold rush was dying down. And most of these early fortune seekers planned on only staying long enough to earn money to send back home to China, and then eventually go back home as well. But many, many more ended up staying longer than expected. The Chinese that came with the gold rushes set up many businesses to support the growing mining industry. They set up tea shops, laundries, restaurants, and formed some of North America's first Chinatowns. These Chinatowns were essentially ethnic ghettos in growing towns, where Chinese would be able to support each other and start businesses. These sprouted up all across the colony, in places like Victoria, New Westminster, Yale, Kamloops, and Lillooet, growing fairly successful communities. While demographic data is a bit murky from this period of time, some estimates indicate that about a third of the non-native population of the goldfields was Chinese, making up large portions of the population, especially in the boom towns like Barkerville, as they worked as laborers and mine owners. In the earliest days of British Columbia's history, they would have quite a few little gold rushes, in places like the Fraser Canyon and the Caribou, and then farther north. But when the gold rushes ended and the colony faced adverse economic conditions, many Chinese decided to stay in the province and create lives for themselves, while many more continued to migrate to what they called Gum San, or Gold Mountain. While migration to the British colony slowed down a little bit after the rushes, the country of Canada was beginning to form, and one of the biggest projects in the history of the British Empire would soon start, the Transcontinental Railway. Building the railway across Canada was no easy task, especially in British Columbia. The West Coast province is covered in towering mountains, which take up close to 85% of the entire province's land area, and make transportation connections incredibly challenging, back then even to now. To lower costs and speed up construction in BC, many Chinese were hired for the project to construct the railway, and the focus point of recruitment became the south of China, particularly in the Guangdong region and Hong Kong, which was recently conquered by the British in the Opium Wars. Many Chinese men in particular came to the province to build the railway, but they faced many challenges and incredibly difficult working conditions, often being used for the most dangerous sections of the railway to construct tunnels and dynamite mountainsides. Unfortunately, it's been estimated that close to 600 Chinese workers died during railway construction, many of which were just buried under the rubble. This immigration to British Columbia also proved to be a bit controversial, as many Europeans in the province felt that the Chinese workers undermined their wages by accepting lower wages and had values that didn't match with the British culture, and as such they all faced a bit of racism. Many whites wanted the railway to be coordinated with an immigration scheme from the British Isle, but this idea ended up being squashed due to the higher cost that it would come with it. The goal at the time was to build the railway. This was one of the reasons why British Columbia came into Confederation, and not building it was seen as a non-starter. Thanks to the railway and gold rushes, though, the towns in the interior of the province ended up having some of the highest percentages of Chinese residents in Canada. In places like Quesnel, deep in the Caribou region, they were the outright majority for several years. And after the gold rushes and the railway, many would stick around in British Columbia to work at the sawmills or start farms throughout the country. The railway was also a major reason why Vancouver grew to become the dominant city in the province, as it was the end point of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and large ports were established in the city for Western Canada's exports. Many Chinese who worked on the railway would end up working at the new ports, and established the city's first Chinatown, which would grow to become one of the largest in North America. Unfortunately for the Chinese in British Columbia, they faced a fair bit of discrimination during this time. In 1872, they lost the ability to vote, and later the federal government implemented the Chinese head tax, which was a sum of money that had to be paid to immigrate to Canada and was designed to discourage Chinese immigration. Canada would end up apologizing for this policy later under the Harper era and compensate the families that paid the heavy toll, but nonetheless it was still a racist policy designed solely to discourage people because they were from China. The head tax would eventually be completely abolished, but this was only because Chinese were just banned from coming to BC, except in very limited circumstances. Despite all the discrimination and racist acts that were created to discourage Chinese immigration, this didn't stop the growth of Metro Vancouver's Chinese community. As the Great Depression hit in the 1930s and economic opportunities in the small towns of the interior and the coast declined, many Chinese ended up moving to Greater Vancouver for better opportunities, resulting in that community growing a bit and centralizing most of the Chinese in one region of the province, a factor that has continued to modern day. Following the Second World War, most of the West concluded that racism was actually bad, and as such, Chinese Immigration Act was repealed in 1947, and the right to vote was given to people of Chinese descent in 1951, partially due to many Chinese serving in the Canadian Armed Forces. Soon after the Chinese were given the right to vote, the first member of Parliament of Chinese descent, Douglas Young, would be elected with the Progressive Conservatives in the Vancouver Centre riding, although it would take until 2022 that Vancouver would elect its first ever Chinese mayor. Although, to be fair, North America's first ever Chinese mayor was actually also elected in BC, but much further away in the interior city of Kamloops, with Peter Wing. After the legislation was repealed, many more Chinese would come to British Columbia to find refuge. China was of course devastated following the Second World War, and shortly thereafter the Civil War with the Communists, so thousands made their way to Canada. After the war, the population of the Chinese in Canada would also spread out a fair bit. While Metro Vancouver remained the main center of Chinese immigration to Canada, Ontario would also start growing a strong Chinese community as immigration by plane began to be more widespread, especially to the Greater Toronto Area and the city of Markham. New York, of course, would also gain a large Chinese population, and currently, by overall numbers, has the largest number of Chinese residents, but as a percentage is still quite low. Many of the communist policies that followed the Civil War, including religious persecution, failed farming collectivization, and a wave of other bad policies, encouraged a lot of Chinese to immigrate to Canada, and the people that came in this wave would influence the culture of the Chinese Canadian community a lot. It was also in the late 1960s to early 1970s that many Chinese in Vancouver, much like the region as a whole, would suburbanize. The suburban cities of Coquitlam, Burnaby, and Richmond in particular would see a lot of Chinese move to these communities, becoming significant portions of the population. This was due to a variety of factors, but it was mostly an attraction to affordable housing, a growing middle class that wanted a bit more space, and a desire for more suburban living in general, which was a general trend among many middle classes across North America around this time period. Richmond in particular would gain a lot of this suburbanization. Richmond is a city adjacent to Vancouver itself, and located on several islands in the Fraser River Delta, the largest of which is Lulu Island, as well as the smaller Sea Island, which holds Vancouver's international airport. Richmond's growth into a center of the Chinese Canadian community was sparked partially due to the suburbanization of the existing Chinese community in Vancouver, and more importantly, from the Hong Kong handover. As I mentioned earlier, the British conquered Hong Kong in the late 1800s, and it served as their main port in China. Hong Kong would grow to become an important center of commerce and grew significantly during the British period, becoming a city home to millions. Many refugees from the wars in China would move to Hong Kong to escape communism, and the laissez-faire economics of the city, along with its connection to the West and China, made businesses absolutely flourish. The issue with Hong Kong's control, though, is that while part of it was to remain British forever, a large chunk was given as a 99-year lease that would end around the turn of the century. Many feared that communist China would take over by force, or through an agreement with the British, which ended up happening. And as such, the handover grew closer. Many Chinese left the city en masse, fearing the communists will take over and change things forever. Vancouver, being the closest city with the largest Chinese population and deep connections to Hong Kong culturally and economically, became a focal point for Hong Kong immigration in the late 80s to early 1990s. Canada was the preferred location for Hong Kongers, in part because investment visas were significantly easier to obtain in Canada than the United States. So while West Coast cities of San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles had significant Chinese diaspora communities, the easier visas in Canada's historic British Empire links made it a much more attractive destination for immigration. As such, tens of thousands of Hong Kongers would move to Metro Vancouver, many of which were wealthy and injected massive amounts of capital into the metro region. Richmond, given its growing Chinese character, became a prime destination for this investment and settlement, and the city's population soared over the next few decades. Richmond's location with Vancouver International Airport made it very attractive for international business and trade. Many Hong Kong Chinese entrepreneurs and business professionals liked this fact, as they could easily travel back and forth between the two cities with ease. While immigration from China did slow down after the handover, and many Chinese now with Canadian citizenship moved back to Hong Kong to take advantage of the territory's post-unification boom, many more stayed and created great lives for themselves in Canada. From the 1990s to modern day, Richmond became the central hub for the province's Chinese community, replacing Chinatown and Vancouver as the central destination of Chinese-owned businesses. Throughout the 80s and 90s, many Chinese-owned businesses, ranging from restaurants and grocery stores to real estate and financial services, started up on the island city. And the presence of these businesses created a positive feedback loop, as a network of economic opportunities that attract and support the Chinese community grew upon each other. The downtown core of Richmond in particular saw a massive amount of new businesses and shopping centers open up, catering to the Hong Kong-born Chinese community. The Aberdeen Centre is a great example of this, as it was built in the early 2000s and became one of the largest Asian malls in North America when it was first built, and gets its name from the Aberdeen area of Hong Kong. Richmond also developed extensive cultural infrastructure that caters to the Chinese community. This includes things like Chinese language schools, cultural centers, and community organizations that promote and preserve Chinese traditions and language, as well as numerous newspapers, radio stations, and cultural events. Overall, the Chinese Canadian community continues to rapidly grow across the country, and in the 2021 census, they made up about 500,000 people, or about a quarter of Metro Vancouver's total population. In Richmond, a city of about 230,000 people, over 50% of the population now identifies as ethnic Chinese,